Grace and John had been waiting for this day for what felt like forever. They were about to become parents, and not just to one baby, but two. They had spent months preparing the nursery, picking out tiny clothes, and imagining what their life would be like with twins. Every night, they would sit together, talking about how wonderful it would be to finally meet their babies. The day finally came. Grace was in the hospital, lying in bed with John holding her hand tightly. The room was filled with excitement, but also a little bit of nervousness. The doctors and nurses were busy getting everything ready, but all Grace and John could think about was seeing their babies for the first time. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the first baby was born. The doctor held up a tiny, prime baby boy. His skin was as fair as snow, and he had the same blue eyes as his mother. Grace and John were overjoyed. Tears filled their eyes as they looked at their perfect baby boy. But then something unexpected happened. The doctor handed the baby to a nurse, and just a few minutes later, the second baby was born. This time it was a baby girl. When the doctor held her up, the room fell silent. Unlike her brother, the baby girl had dark brown skin and curly black hair. Grace and John stared in shock. How could this be? How could their twins look so different? The room that was filled with happiness just moments ago now felt strange and confusing. The nurses exchanged quick glances, and the doctor cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. Grace's heart raced. She looked at John, hoping he had some explanation, but he looked just as confused as she was. Is everything okay? She asked, her voice trembling. The doctor nodded, but his eyes looked worried. As the nurses wrapped the babies in blankets, whispers started to fill the room. Grace could hear them talking quietly. Words like impossible and how could this happen reached her ears. The joy of the birth was quickly fading, replaced by a feeling of fear and doubt. John squeezed Grace's hand, trying to stay strong for her, but deep down he was scared too. How could their babies be so different? What did this mean? The moment that was supposed to be the happiest of their lives was now filled with questions and confusion. And as they held their new babies, Grace and John couldn't help but wonder if something was terribly wrong. They didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a mystery that would change their lives forever. The days after the birth should have been filled with joy, but instead, there was a heavy cloud hanging over Grace and John. Grace was resting in her hospital bed, holding the twins close to her. She tried to focus on the happiness of having them in her arms, but something didn't feel right. The room was too quiet, and the nurses seemed to be acting strangely. John noticed it too. Whenever a nurse came into the room, she would smile at them, but the smile never reached her eyes. As soon as she thought no one was looking, she would glance at the twins with a puzzled expression, then quickly look away. It made John feel uneasy. One afternoon, while Grace was napping, John decided to take a walk around the hospital to clear his mind. He needed some fresh air, but what he found instead only made his worries grow. As he passed by the nurse's station, he overheard two nurses talking in hushed voices. I just don't understand it. One nurse said, "How can they be twins? They look so different." The other nurse nodded. I know. And did you hear what Dr. Stevens said? He's not sure if both babies have the same father. John's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The thought of someone questioning whether he was the father of both babies felt like a punch to the gut. How could they even suggest such a thing? He wanted to burst into the room and tell them they were wrong, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Instead, he turned and walked back to Grace's room, his mind racing with a million thoughts. When he got there, Grace was awake, holding the twins and smiling softly at them. But as soon as she saw John's face, her smile faded. What's wrong? She asked, her voice full of concern. John didn't want to upset her, but he couldn't keep it to himself. The nurses, they're talking about us, Grace. They're saying the twins. They think they might not both be mine. Grace's eyes widened in shock. What? That's ridiculous. How could they say that? But deep down, Grace felt a twist of fear in her stomach. Could the nurses be right? How could their babies look so different? John sat down beside her, running his hands through his hair. I don't know, Grace. I don't know what to think anymore. Everything was supposed to be perfect. And now it feels like everything is falling apart. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. She loved her babies more than anything, but the doubts were creeping in. What if something was wrong? What if the nurses knew something they didn't? She looked at her babies, her son with his fair skin and blue eyes, and her daughter with her dark skin and curly hair. They were both so beautiful, but the differences between them were impossible to ignore. I'm scared, John, Grace whispered. I don't know what's happening, and I don't know what to do. John took her hand, trying to stay strong for both of them, but the fear was growing inside him too. The whispers, the odd looks, the doubts. They were like shadows, creeping into their lives and stealing away the happiness it should have been feeling. As the day turned into night, the hospital room felt colder and more isolated. The couple felt like they were drifting further away from the world, lost in a sea of confusion and fear. Every time a nurse entered the room, they couldn't help but wonder what she was really thinking. Were they talking about them behind closed doors? Were they laughing at them? Or worse, did they know something that Grace and John didn't? The joy of having their twins had been tainted by uncertainty, and now they were left questioning everything. The love they had for each other and their babies was strong, but the shadows of doubt were growing darker, and they didn't know how to chase them away. As Grace lay awake that night, listening to the soft breathing of her babies, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. But what could it be? And what were they supposed to do next? The answers were out of reach, leaving them trapped in a web of suspense and fear with no clear way out. The unease that had settled over John and Grace wouldn't go away. Every time John looked at his twins, he felt a mix of love and confusion. He couldn't stop thinking about what the nurses had said, and the more he thought about it, the more he needed answers. One morning, after a restless night, John decided it was time to talk to the doctor. He needed to know what was going on, and he hoped the doctor could explain it in a way that would make everything make sense again. Maybe then the strange feelings would go away. John found Dr. Stevens in his office, looking through some papers. The doctor smiled warmly when he saw John, but quickly noticed the worry on his face. "John, what brings you here? Is everything okay with Grace and the babies?" John hesitated, not sure how to begin. "Doctor, I need to talk to you about the twins. I'm really confused, and honestly, I'm scared. How could they be so different? Is there something wrong?" Dr. Stevens motioned for John to sit down. "I understand your concerns, John. It's not uncommon for parents to worry when things don't seem to make sense. But let me assure you," John frowned. "What do you mean by that? How could something like this happen?" The doctor leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Well, John, genes are passed down from parents, grandparents, and even further back in the family line. Sometimes traits can skip generations, and we end up with surprises like this. It's rare, but not impossible." John listened, but something inside him wasn't satisfied with the answer. It felt too simple, too convenient. "So you're saying it's just a random thing? That there's no reason to worry?" Dr. Stevens nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made John's stomach tighten. In most cases, that would be the explanation. But the doctor paused. "If you're feeling uncertain, there's a way to be sure." John leaned forward, his heart pounding. "How?" The doctor hesitated, then continued, "We could do a DNA test. It would confirm paternity and maybe put your mind at ease. It's entirely up to you." John's breath caught in his throat. A DNA test? The very idea made him feel sick to the stomach, but at the same time the doubt had already taken root. He had to know the truth, even if it was terrifying. "What would a DNA test tell us exactly?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Stevens looked at John with a serious expression. "It would tell us if you are the biological father of both babies. It's just a precaution, but if it will help ease your mind, it might be worth considering." John's thoughts were spinning. Was this what it had come to? Testing his own children to see if they were really his? It felt like a nightmare, something that should be happening to him and Grace. But now that the idea was out there, he couldn't ignore it. There was something lurking behind all of this, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The doctor's calm explanation wasn't enough to chase away the shadows that seemed to be growing larger by the day. John took a deep breath and stood up. "I need to talk to Grace about this." "Of course," Dr. Stevens said, standing up as well. "Take your time, John. Whatever you decide, we're here to help." John nodded and left the office, feeling more lost than ever. The thought of the DNA test hung over him like a dark cloud. What if the results weren't what he wanted to hear? What if they uncovered something even more disturbing? As he walked back to Grace's room, his heart felt heavy. He knew he had to tell her about the doctor's suggestion, but he also knew it would break her heart. The joy they had once felt about their twins was now buried under a mountain of fear and uncertainty. John opened the door to Grace's room and saw her sitting on the bed, holding the twins and smiling softly at them. When she looked up and saw the expression on John's face, her smile faded. "What did the doctor say?" she asked, her voice full of worry. John sat down beside her, trying to find the right words. He said, He said that sometimes genes can be strange. But Grace, he also said we could do a DNA test, just to be sure. Grace's eyes widened in shock. A DNA test? Why? Do they think something's wrong? John shook his head quickly. No. It's just to put our minds at ease, to make sure everything is as it should be. Grace's hands tightened around the babies, and she looked down at them, her eyes filling with tears. But John, what if the test says something we don't want to hear? What if it changed everything? John didn't know how to answer that. The truth was, he was just as scared as she was. But the doubt was already there, gnawing away at him. He didn't want to do the test, but he couldn't live with the uncertainty either. I don't know, Grace, he said softly, but I think we need to find out the truth, no matter what it is. Grace looked up at him, her eyes full of fear. Okay, John, we'll do the test. But whatever happens, we have to promise to stick together. No matter what the results say, these are our babies, and we love them. John nodded, pulling her into a tight hug. I promise, Grace, no matter what. But as he held her, the sense of something unknown lurking in the shadows only grew stronger. The secrets in the blood were about to be revealed, and John couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. The decision to take the DNA test weighed heavily on both Grace and John. Even though they had agreed it was the best thing to do, the waiting was unbearable. Every moment felt like a lifetime as they waited for the results that could change everything. Grace spent most of her time in the nursery, rocking the twins in her arms. She couldn't help but notice every little difference between them. Her son's fair skin and blue eyes reminded her so much of John. But when she looked at her daughter's dark skin and curly hair, a wave of guilt washed over her. What if this is my fault? Grace whispered to herself, tears welling up in her eyes. What if I did something wrong? The thought haunted her day and night. She loved both of her children more than anything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow caused this strange situation. Every time she looked at John, she saw the worry etched on his face, and it made her heart ache. John tried to stay strong for Grace, but inside he was falling apart. He could see how much this was hurting her, and it tore him up to see the woman he loved so sad and scared. But he was scared too, scared of what the results might say, scared of losing the family they had dreamed of. Whenever he was alone, John found himself pacing back and forth, his mind racing. He kept replaying the doctor's words in his head, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the nagging fear that something was terribly wrong. Finally, the day arrived. The DNA results were ready. The envelope was delivered to them in the morning, and it sat on the kitchen table like a ticking time bomb. Neither of them wanted to be the first to open it. Grace sat down at the table, staring at the envelope with trembling hands. John stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The room was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that made it hard to breathe. John, Grace whispered, her voice shaking, I'm scared. What if the results say something we don't want to hear? John swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. Whatever happens, Grace, we'll face it together. Remember, we promised. No matter what. With a deep breath, Grace nodded and slowly opened the envelope. The paper inside seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as she pulled it out and unfolded it. John leaned in closer, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. Grace's eyes scanned the page, and she felt her stomach drop. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but there was one line that stood out clearly. Only one of the twins is biologically related to John. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. John quickly picked it up, his eyes darting over the words. When he saw the truth, his face went pale. How? How can this be? John stammered, his voice barely a whisper. How can only one of them be mine? Grace couldn't speak. The room spun around her as she tried to make sense of the impossible. Her mind was flooded with questions, but none of them had answers. How could this happen? They had always been faithful to each other, always been together. How could one of their children not be his? John felt a wave of emotions crash over him, shock, confusion, and a deep aching sadness. He looked at the twins who were peacefully sleeping in the next room, completely unaware of the turmoil their parents were going through. For a moment, he felt a pang of anger, not at Grace, but at the situation. How could this happen to them, to their family? But the anger quickly faded, replaced by a cold, empty feeling of loss. Grace reached out to John, Her voice choked with tears. John, I don't understand. I don't know how this happened. I love you, and I would never. John took her hands, squeezing it tightly. I know, Grace, I know you wouldn't. But this changed everything. I don't know what to think. The tension in the room was unbearable. The truth was out, but it only raised more questions than answers. The twins, who were supposed to be the perfect symbol of their love, now represented a mystery that could tear them apart. As they sat there, holding each other and trying to process what they had just learned, a deep, unsettling feeling settled into their hearts. The shadows of doubt had grown darker, and the sense of something unknown lurking in their lives was stronger than ever. The test of truth had revealed a secret that neither of them could have imagined, and now they were left to face the devastating reality of what that truth meant for their family. One evening, unable to hold back his emotions any longer, John confronted Grace. He found her in the nursery, gently rocking the twins to sleep. The sight that used to fill him with warmth now only added to his confusion and pain. Grace, he said, his voice low and trembling, I need to know the truth. I need to know how this happened. Grace looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. She saw the pain in his eyes and it broke her heart. John, I've told you everything I know. I swear to you, I've never been with anyone else. I don't understand it either. John's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to believe her, he really did, but the doubts wouldn't let him. How can I believe that, Grace? How can I believe that when the proof says otherwise? Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. I don't know how to explain it, John. I love you, and I've never done anything to hurt you. You have to believe me. But John shook his head, his face contorted with anguish. How can I? How can I just ignore what the test says? One of these babies isn't mine, Grace. How am I supposed to deal with that? Grace felt like the ground was falling out from under her. She couldn't lose John. Not after everything they had been through together. Please, John, don't do this. We can figure it out. We can find out what really happened. But you have to trust me. John turned away from her, his heart heavy with sorrow. I don't know if I can, Grace. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Grace's breath caught in her throat. John, please, don't say that. I love you. We can get through this. We have to, for the twins. But John's mind was clouded with doubt and anger. How can I raise a child that isn't mine? How can I stay with you when I don't know if I can trust you anymore? The words struck Grace like a blow. She felt her heart breaking into pieces, the pain almost too much to bear. John, you're my husband. We made vows. Don't throw it all away because of this thing we don't even understand. But John's face hardened. The love they once shared seemed so far away now, buried under layers of betrayal and hurt. I don't know what to do, Grace. I need time. I need to think. With that, he walked out of the nursery, leaving Grace standing there, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. She looked down at the twins, their tiny faces so innocent and peaceful, and her tears began to fall. How had everything gone so wrong? Days passed, and the distance between Grace and John only grew. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was strained and cold. John spent more and more time away from home, avoiding the painful reality that awaited him there. The love that had once been the foundation of their relationship was crumbling, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Grace tried to hold on to hope, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand. Every night she cried herself to sleep, clutching the twins close to her chest, afraid of what the future held. She couldn't understand why this was happening, why her family was falling apart. Finally, one evening, John came home and told Grace the words she had been dreading. I can't do this anymore, Grace. I need to leave. I need to figure out what I want, what I can live with. Grace's heart shattered. John, no. Please don't leave. We can work this out. We need to stay together for the twins. But John shook his head, his eyes full of sadness and regret. I'm sorry, Grace. I can't. I need time to think. Maybe we can find a way back to each other. But right now, I don't know how. With that, John packed a small bag and walked out the door, leaving Grace alone in the house that had once been filled with love and laughter. Now it was just a hollow shell, echoing with the pain of a family torn apart. Grace collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The man she loved, the father of her children, was gone, and she didn't know if he would ever come back. As she held the twins close, feeling their tiny breaths against her skin, Grace's sorrow deepened. She was alone, with no answers, no comfort, and a heart that felt like it had been fractured beyond repair. John's departure from home left him in a state of emotional turmoil. The love he once felt for Grace was now tangled with confusion and doubt. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story, something hidden in the shadows of the past. He decided that if he couldn't find peace in the present, maybe the answers lay in the past. He began to dig into Grace's family history, hoping to find some explanation that would make sense of the DNA results. He spent hours poring over old family photos, letters, and documents, searching for anything that could explain how one of the twins could be so different. As he dug deeper, he found an old dusty box in the attic of his in-laws' home. Inside, he discovered letters and photographs from decades ago, some of them brittle with age. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was written in delicate, looping handwriting that he recognized as Grace's grandmother's. The letter was addressed to Grace's mother and spoke of a deep, hidden secret, one that had been buried for years. As John read, his eyes widened with shock. The letter revealed that Grace's grandmother had once been in love with a man from Africa. They had a child together, but in those times such relationships were frowned upon, especially in their small town. To avoid scandal, the child was sent away, and the family never spoke of it again. The letter was filled with sorrow and regret, as Grace's grandmother had been forced to hide a piece of her heart for fear of judgment and shame. The child was never mentioned again, and the secret was buried deep within the family's history. John sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. Could it be that the genetic traits from Grace's grandmother and her lost child had resurfaced in their daughter? It was a possibility that hadn't even crossed his mind before. The idea that the past could reach into the present and create such a mystery was both fascinating and unsettling. But even as he considered this explanation, the doubt still lingered. The pain of betrayal and the uncertainty of the DNA results were still fresh in his mind. Could he really accept this as the answer? Or was he just grasping at straws, trying to find something, anything, that would make sense of the mess his life had become? He decided to confront Grace with what he had found. He returned to the house, where Grace was still alone with the twins. When she saw John at the door, her heart leaped with a mix of hope and fear. She had been praying for him to come back, but she didn't know what he would say or if he was ready to forgive her. John entered the house, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. He looked at Grace, seeing the pain and sorrow etched on her face. "Grace, I found something. Something that might explain what's happened." Grace's eyes widened as John handed her the letter. She unfolded it carefully, her hand shaking as she read the words. Tears welled up in her eyes as she recognized her grandmother's handwriting and the heartbreaking confession within the letter. "I never knew," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "My mother never told me. I had no idea that this was part of our family's past." John sat down beside her, his emotions a whirlwind. It could explain why one of the twins looked so different. Maybe the genetic traits from your grandmother's child came out in our daughter. Grace nodded, wiping away her tears. "I think you're right, John. It makes sense. But why didn't my mother tell me? Why did she keep this secret for so long?" John sighed, the conflict still gnawing at him. "I don't know, Grace. Maybe she was ashamed, or maybe she just wanted to protect you from the pain of the past. But even if this explains the twins, it doesn't change what the DNA test said. And that's what I'm struggling with." Grace reached out and took John's hand, her grip firm and desperate. "John, I swear to you, I've never been unfaithful. I love you, and I've always been true to you. This letter, it's the only explanation that makes sense. Please, you have to believe me." John looked into her eyes, seeing the sincerity and the pain there. He wanted to believe her, wanted to accept this explanation and move on. But the doubt was still there, a dark shadow that refused to let go. "I want to believe you, Grace," John said quietly. "But this has shaken me to my core. I don't know how to move past it. I don't know if I can." Grace's heart broke as she heard the uncertainty in his voice. "Please, John, don't let this tear us apart. We can get through this. We have to, for the twins." John looked at the twins, who were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm raging in their parents' hearts. He knew that whatever happened next would shape their family's future. The mystery of the past had given them an explanation, but it hadn't erased the pain or the doubts. Now, John and Grace were left to decide if their love was strong enough to overcome the fractures that had formed between them. As they sat together in silence, the weight of the decision they faced pressed down on them, heavy and unforgiving. The path forward was unclear, and the shadows of the past continued to loom over their fractured hearts. Just when it seemed like the mystery surrounding the twins might be solved, life took another unexpected turn. One afternoon, as Grace was feeding the twins and John was quietly reading in the living room, there was a knock at the door. The sound echoed through the house, and for some reason, it sent a chill down Grace's spine. John got up to answer it, feeling the same unease. When he opened the door, he was met by an unfamiliar face. A man in his late 50s, with gray hair and a serious expression. The man looked at John with a piercing gaze, as if he was searching for something in his eyes. "Can I help you?" John asked, his voice cautious. The man cleared his throat and spoke with a deep, gravely voice. "My name is Robert. I'm an old friend of Grace's family. I know I'm showing up out of the blue, but I need to talk to you both. It's important about your twins." Hearing this, Grace quickly joined John at the door, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" "What about our twins?" Robert looked at Grace, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "May I come in? I think it's better if we talk inside." John and Grace exchanged a worried glance but stepped aside to let Robert in. They led him to the living room where they all sat down, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. "Please just tell us what you know," Grace urged, unable to bear the suspense. Robert sighed heavily, rubbing his hands together as if trying to find the right words. "I've known your family for many years, Grace. Your grandmother was a dear friend of mine, and she confided in me many things over the years. But what I'm here to talk about isn't from the past. It's about the day your twins were born." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What about that day?" Robert leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "I don't want to alarm you, but I have reason to believe that something sinister happened at the hospital when your twins were born. I've heard rumors, whispers about a possible baby switch, or worse." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "A baby switch? How could that happen? Why would anyone do that?" Robert shook his head. "I don't know the details, but I do know that the hospital has been under investigation before, quietly, of course, over concerns about their maternity ward. There were cases of switched babies, and even some that disappeared entirely." The room fell into a stunned silence. John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Are you saying that one of our babies might not be ours? That someone else's child could have been given to us?" Robert nodded slowly. "It's a possibility. And if it's true, then the DNA test results make a lot more sense, don't they? The baby that isn't biologically yours might not even be your child at all." Grace felt like the ground was spinning beneath her. She had thought they were beginning to understand what had happened, but now, everything was thrown into chaos once again. "But how can we know for sure?" she whispered, tears in her eyes. Robert looked at them both, his expression grim. "You need to go back to the hospital. You need to ask questions, demand answers. If something did happen, they'll have records somewhere. But be prepared, because the truth might be even darker than you expect." John's mind was racing. If what Robert said was true, then everything they had believed since the twins were born could be a lie. He couldn't let this go. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "We'll go back to the hospital," John said, his voice determined. "We'll find out what really happened." Grace nodded, though her heart was heavy with fear. "John, what if he's right? What if one of our babies isn't really ours? What do we do then?" John took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But we have to know the truth." The tension between them was palpable as they prepared to go back to the hospital. The love they had for their children was unquestionable, but now they were haunted by the possibility that their family was not what they thought it was. The shadow of doubt that had hung over them from the beginning was now darker and more menacing than ever. As they drove to the hospital, the weight of Robert's words pressed down on them. The twins slept peacefully in the backseat, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing around them. Grace and John were caught in a web of uncertainty, with no clear way out. When they arrived at the hospital, the familiar halls that had once been filled with hope now felt ominous and foreboding. They approached the front desk, their resolve firm but their hearts filled with dread. "We need to speak with someone in charge," John said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "It's about our twins, and it's urgent." The hospital staff glanced at each other, a flicker of unease passing between them. The atmosphere was thick with suspense as Grace and John were led down the long corridor, the walls closing in on them with each step. They had no idea what they would find, but they knew that whatever the truth was, it would change their lives forever. The mystery that had haunted them from the moment the twins were born was about to unravel, and the secrets hidden within the walls of the hospital were about to be exposed. As they prepared to face the unknown, the bond between them was tested like never before. Would they find the strength to overcome the darkness, or would the truth tear them apart for good? The answer lay just beyond the doors they were about to open. Finally, a senior nurse with a solemn expression led them into a small office where a stack of files sat ominously on the desk. "We've been expecting you," the nurse said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made John's heart sink. "I understand you have concerns about the birth of your twins." John exchanged a nervous glance with the priest before speaking. "We need to know the truth. We've heard things that suggest there might have been a mistake, that our twins, that they might not both be ours." The nurse took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and regret. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I wish I could tell you that everything is fine, but the truth is, there was a mix-up in the maternity ward on the night your twins were born." Grace's breath caught in her throat, and John felt his heart pound in his chest. "What do you mean, a mix-up?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The nurse pulled out a file from the stack and opened it, revealing documents filled with medical records and reports. "It appears that there was a mistake during the identification process of the newborns. Two couples were giving birth around the same time in adjacent delivery rooms. Due to a combination of staff shortages and a system failure that night, the identification tags on two of the babies were swapped." John's mind was reeling as he tried to process the information. "What are you saying? That one of our babies isn't really ours?" The nurse nodded slowly. "Yes. We believe that the baby girl with darker skin, she may belong to the other couple and their baby. Well, their baby might be yours." Grace let out a strangled cry, her hands trembling as she clutched John's arm. "No, this can't be true. How could this happen? How could they let this happen?" The nurse's eyes were filled with sorrow. "I'm so sorry. We didn't realize the mistake until now. The other couple, they haven't been notified yet. We wanted to confirm the truth before involving them." John felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. The idea that their daughter, the child they had loved and cared for, might not be theirs, while their real child could be out there with another family was too much to bear. What do we do now?" The nurse closed the file and looked at them with deep sympathy. "We can conduct another DNA test to confirm this. But I have to be honest with you, the hospital's policy in these situations is to correct the mistake. That would mean reuniting each child with their biological parents." Grace broke down into sobs, the thought of losing her daughter unbearable. "But she's our daughter. We've been raising her, loving her. How can we just give her up?" John's heart was breaking too. He couldn't imagine having to give up either of the twins. They were both a part of him now, regardless of biology. Is there no other way? Can't we keep her even if she isn't biologically ours? The nurse hesitated. In some cases, families have been able to negotiate an arrangement, but it's complicated, and it depends on what the other family wants. If they agree, you might be able to keep both children. But if they don't, you could be forced to return her. The room fell into a heavy silence as John and Grace grappled with the impossible choice before them. The joy of having twins had turned into a nightmare, and now they faced the terrifying prospect of losing one of their children. "What about the other couple?" John asked, his voice strained. "What if they don't want to give up the baby they've been raising?" The nurse sighed. "That's something we would have to discuss with them, but you should prepare yourselves for the possibility that they might feel the same way you do. It could get very difficult very quickly." Grace wiped her tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. "We need to know. We need to know for sure if this is true." John nodded in agreement, though the thought of going through with another DNA test filled him with dread. "We'll do the test," he said, his voice resolute. "But I want you to understand something. We love both of these children, and we're not going to just hand one of them over without a fight." The nurse nodded, understanding their determination. "I'll arrange for the test. In the meantime, I suggest you try to prepare yourselves for whatever comes next. This is going to be a very difficult road." As they left the office, the weight of the situation pressed down on them even harder. The drive home was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, haunted by the dark revelation they had just uncovered. Back at home, as Grace and John sat together, holding their twins close, the reality of what they might face in the coming days settled in. The thought of having to confront the other couple, to possibly exchange their daughter for another child they had never met, was almost too much to bear. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out, and the decisions they made in the coming days would change their lives forever. The suspense of what was to come hung over them like a dark cloud, and they knew that whatever happened, nothing would ever be the same again. As the twins slept peacefully in their arms, unaware of the turmoil surrounding them, Grace and John realized that the love they had for these children would be tested in ways they never imagined. And as they waited for the next steps, the fear of losing one of their babies loomed large, casting a shadow over their hearts. The days following the revelation at the hospital were some of the hardest Grace and John had ever faced. The knowledge that one of their beloved twins might not be theirs biologically, and that their real child could be out there with another family, weighed heavily on their hearts. They knew that soon they would have to make a decision, one that would change their lives forever. Every time Grace looked at the twins, her son with his fair skin and blue eyes, and her daughter with her dark skin and curly hair, she felt a wave of love and pain. How could she choose? How could she give up either one of them? One evening, after the twins had been put to bed, Grace and John sat together on the couch, the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. Finally, John spoke, his voice low and filled with emotion. Grace, we need to talk about what we're going to do. The DNA test is going to confirm everything. And then we'll have to decide, do we try to find the other family, or do we keep the twins and just let it be? Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. John, I don't know what to do. I can't imagine giving up either of them. They're our babies. But what if the other family is out there feeling the same way we are? What if they want their child back? How can we deny them that? John's heart ached as he looked at his wife, knowing that she was just as torn as he was. I know, but I keep thinking, what if we do find the other family, and it turns into a legal battle? What if we lose both of them? I can't bear the thought of that. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their dilemma pressing down upon them. It felt like there was no right answer, no path that wouldn't lead to heartbreak. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice trembling. John, I've been thinking. Maybe it doesn't matter whose DNA they have. Maybe what matters is that we love them, and we've been raising them as our own. They're our family no matter what. John looked at her, feeling the glimmer of hope in the midst of their pain. You really think we could just keep them both? Forget about the other family, about the mix-up? Grace nodded, though her heart was still heavy with uncertainty. Yes, because in the end, it's not about biology. It's about love. We've already bonded with them, and they've bonded with us. We're their parents, and they're our children. Maybe that's all that matters. John felt a tear slip down his cheek as he reached out and took Grace's hand. I want to believe that, Grace. I really do. But I keep thinking about the other family. What if they're out there missing their child? How can we live with that? Grace's tears flowed freely now, and she squeezed John's hand tightly. I don't know, John. I don't know how we're supposed to make this decision. But I do know that I can't bear the thought of losing either of them. They're both ours, in every way that matters. John pulled her into his arms, holding her close as they both cried. The pain of their situation was almost too much to bear, but deep down, they knew that they had to make a decision soon. After what felt like hours, John finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Grace, I think you're right. We've been through so much already, and these babies, they're ours. We've loved them from the moment they were born. I don't think I could give that up. Not for anything. Grace looked up at him, hope mingling with her tears. So, what are you saying, John? Are we going to keep them both? John nodded, though the decision was still filled with uncertainty and fear. Yes, we'll keep them both. We'll raise them as our own, no matter what the DNA test says. We'll be their parents, and we'll love them with everything we have. The relief that flooded Grace's heart was overwhelming. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, but at least now they had a plan. A path forward that didn't involve tearing their family apart. As they held each other, they felt a sense of peace settle over them, even in the midst of their turmoil. They had made their decision, and now they had to stand by it. The mystery of the twins' birth might never be fully solved, but that didn't change the love they had for their children. The next morning, they woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. As they looked at the twins who were smiling and cooing in their cribs, they knew they had made the right choice. These were their children, and nothing, no DNA test, no hospital mix-up, could change that. They had chosen love, and that love would be the foundation of their family, no matter what the future held. As they vowed to protect and cherish their twins, they knew that they had finally found their way through the darkness. The heart's dilemma had been resolved, and now they could begin to heal and build the life they had always dreamed of together. In the weeks and months that followed their decision, John and Grace found a new rhythm in their lives. The tension and fear that had once consumed them slowly began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of peace and certainty. They had chosen to keep their family together, to love both of their twins with all their hearts, and now they were seeing the beauty of that decision unfold every day. John and Grace's commitment to each other grew stronger as they navigated the challenges that came their way. There were still moments of doubt, fleeting thoughts of the other family that might be out there, but those thoughts were always outweighed by the overwhelming love they felt for their children. They had built a life together, and nothing could tear it apart now. The twins, unaware of the turmoil that had once surrounded their birth, thrived in the warm, loving environment their parents had created. Grace and John marveled at how quickly the babies were growing, how their personalities were beginning to emerge. Their son was curious and adventurous, always reaching for new things and exploring his world with wide-eyed wonder. Their daughter, with her bright smile and infectious laugh, brought joy to everyone around her. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting a golden glow over the nursery, Grace and John stood together, watching the twins play in their cribs. The room was filled with soft laughter and the gentle coos of the babies, and for the first time in a long while, John felt completely at peace. "Look at them," Grace whispered, leaning her head on John's shoulder. "They're so happy. I know we made the right choice." John smiled, wrapping his arm around her waist. "We did. They're our children no matter what, and they always will be." As the twins played, reaching out to each other with tiny hands, John and Grace couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had been through so much, fear, doubt, and heartbreak, but in the end, love had guided them to the right decision. The bond they had formed with their children was unbreakable, forged through the trials they had faced together. Over time, the mystery of the twins' birth became less important. The questions that had once haunted them faded into the background, replaced by the joy of watching their children grow. They still didn't know exactly what had happened in the hospital that night, and they might never know, but that was okay. They had found peace in their decision, and that was all that mattered. As the years passed, John and Grace's love for each other deepened. The challenges they had faced had only made them stronger, and they knew they could overcome anything as long as they were together. Their family, once fractured by doubt and fear, was now whole and united by a bond that could never be broken. On the twins' first birthday, they threw a small celebration with just the four of them. As they watched their children dig into their birthday cake with chubby hands, laughing and smiling, John and Grace felt an overwhelming sense of pride and happiness. They had come so far, and now they were reaping the rewards of their hard-won peace. That night, after the twins were tucked into bed, Grace and John sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky. They held hands, content in the knowledge that their love had carried them through the darkest of times. "You know," John said softly, "I used to think that our family had to be perfect. No secrets, no mysteries, just the four of us, simple and happy. But now I realize that it's the challenges we face that make us stronger, that make our bond unbreakable." Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't agree more. We might not have all the answers, but we have each other. And that's enough for me." John nodded, his heart full of love and gratitude. "Me too, Grace, me too." As they sat together, the cool breeze gently rustling the leaves around them, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The love they had for each other and their children was stronger than any mystery, any challenge, and it would see them through whatever came next. Their journey had been difficult, but it had brought them to this moment. A moment of pure, unshakable love. And as they watched the stars above, they knew that their bond as a family was truly unbreakable. The story of their twins, with all its twists and turns, had not only tested their love, but had also strengthened it. And now, as they looked ahead to the future, they knew that nothing could ever tear them apart. They were a family bound by love, and that love would carry them through anything. And so, with hearts full of love and a future full of hope, John and Grace embraced the life they had built together. The life of a family united, a family strong, a family bound by an unbreakable bond. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story and want more captivating tales that stir your emotions and ignite your imagination, be sure to subscribe. Join our community today and never miss out on the latest stories that touch your heart and inspire your soul. Subscribe now to stay connected and dive into a world of unforgettable stories.